All right. Welcome today to our talk of a day in the life of a SOC team. I'm here with my team. I will let them introduce themselves. But the big thing here today that we wanted to discuss is that day in a life. And really, what does that involve? What's that typical day? Why is alert fatigue and just SOC chaos still a thing? Why are we still missing breaches? Why are these things still popping up in the media? Uh, how annoying is it that they're popping up and you have a manager or a CISO coming to you asking you those questions? How should you be addressing your team or starting to build your team? And what are you thinking about while you're doing this? How do you successfully hunt and build for detections, as well as strengthen your maturity in your overall SOC? So I'm going to introduce right now Kevin and Rohit and Michael and let them kind of give them a little background of themselves. And guys, I'd love to hear, while you present, yourself to the world, go ahead and give a little bit of a overview of not only who you are, but maybe your some big direct pains that you frequently have seen or see when it comes to living your day in the life of a SOC. So Kevin, we'll start with you.
Sure thing. So Kevin Gonzalez, Director of Security here at Anvil. Prior lives working as managing security operations, engineering, and architecture for multiple Fortune 200 organizations, and consulting for several organizations, helping them build up security analytic programs and security operation centers. Pain points. I guess from the operations and the engineering and architecture side, there's pain points all around, right? Starting with the engineers trying to get data in. Operation analysts are always asking, hey, we need this new data set or whatnot, and trying to bring it in a normalized, already production ready to use way, right? It is very difficult. There's a lot of things that come in. So a lot of analysts are always having a hard time trying to go ahead and actually get the data in. And then once it's in, it's like, well, it's not usable, right? So I think that's probably the biggest pain point that I always hear over time, just across those three different areas.
Great. And Rohit?
Hey, everybody. Just want to say thanks for tuning into this webinar. Hope you get a lot of value out of it. My name is Rohit Kandetti. I'm a forward deployed engineer over at Anvil. In my prior life, I used to be a threat hunting and content creation lead over at JP Morgan. I started my career off as a tier 1 SOC analyst, 8 years ago, and kind of worked my way up to be a manager. So, throughout that journey, I saw a lot of how things look like from like the operations side of things, how things look like from like a managerial side of things. So some of the biggest pain points I think I came across was, one of the quotes we always used was, 24 hours in a day is never enough, right? So it's really just managing your time effectively. And, what exactly does that mean when you're trying to be effective? I've had a lot of analysts come to me in the past and just say, what do I focus on? What are my priorities, right? And you guys know this, working in a SOC, those priorities shift on a constant basis based on, what's the topic of the day, what's the topic of the week. So we'll definitely tackle, a lot of these pain points and how we're addressing them over here in Anvil, how we can kind of help you, but just in general, right?
Great, thank you. Yeah, I look forward to talking about that. I know that when we talked earlier, you guys were very passionate about that subject. So I think that we're going to have a good conversation around that. Mike, what would you like to go?
Sure. I'm Mike Monty. I'm a forward deployed engineer here at Anvil. Previous life, I was at JP Morgan Chase. Also started as a tier 1 analyst and worked my way up to be the cyber cloud detection engineering lead. Some of the pain points that I can think of is the increasing technologies into an environment and the expansion of the threat landscape and the demand for content and sort of being reactive and trying to be proactive at the same time. It feels like you're constantly running in circles. Kind of talking through those points, there's a lot of things that sort of contribute to that. And that's, different workflows and ensuring that you have the right workflows in place, building automation around, your security operations center and, trying to stay up to date with all the different technologies and the different threats out there in order to make sure that you're doing the right things. So looking forward to talk about all of those points.
Awesome. And we have Rebecca in true day in a life of a SOC. You never know what's going to happen. And even better, she was able to pop in and handle whatever it was that was going on in her SOC. So Rebecca, if you want to, we're doing a little introduction and kind of going over your biggest pain point that you're seeing or have seen in your past.
Yeah, terribly sorry for being late. Like you said, socks, especially ones that are growing and new, definitely every day is a little bit different. So I think the biggest pain point I have right now is especially, I created my sock environment about 7 months ago, is just gaining actual visibility and finding data that matters. We have access to a bunch of different data forms, but if you can't really do anything with it, what's the point of it? So it's just trying to figure out what's data that's actionable, that's usable, and that we can move forward with.
Yeah, and I kind of hear that resonating throughout everything you're saying is this concept of data, right? Like we all know it's usable when it is usable, when it's actually structured. But once you get into workflows and all of these things, then it seemingly becomes very, whether the data is structured, the how you work with it becomes very unstructured, it seems like. And so I just keep hearing this from customers, from you guys, of just this struggle of truly how do you get business value? And instead of just adding more noise by adding more tools. So I guess really it leaves me asking you guys, what can we do with all that data and how can we start to solve these visibility and getting data in and knowing the right data problems?
Well, I mean, I don't mind. Nope, sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, no, so I just to kind of talk about that, right? There's also the point of ensuring you have a right amount compute in order to bring in the right data, right? So there's the question of, do we have the right data? But in addition to that, do we have the right fields within that data feed in order to do our jobs? And then are all of the devices actually reporting to that specific data feed so that we're having the right coverage from a detection standpoint? All of those challenges can be very hard, and it's important to have health monitoring to ensure that your devices are reporting, and all the necessary data feeds are there in order to sort of have that data within your SIM. The second part of that is ensuring that data is normalized, right? So how can we use that data in data models, for example, in order to build detections across not necessarily one data feed that's specific to one technology, but network data that you can bring in from all different technologies. So as your company kind of moves from technology to technology, the underlying content that you're creating on that specific data feed can apply to more than one.
And Rebecca, I think you had a thought too around.
Yeah, I mean, what Mike said obviously about computing power, cannot emphasize that enough. I know that's something in previous SOCs I've worked in, we've run into issues. But as far as like figuring out the correct data, we do a lot of efficiency testing based off of building what our detections are and figuring out, are our detections actually finding actionable alerts, things that would result to an incident. And then based off of whether it's anywhere from 5 to 70% correct, then we kind of figure out from there what's actual usable data that we want to ingest.
Yeah, and just to branch off to that, right? I mean, I think a lot of times it's not just, hey, we need this data set or something from the operations side, but a lot of it falls on engineering to understand how to get the right data over, right? So a lot of times it's like, well, let's go ahead and let's set up this logging structure and send it over to whatever SIM is necessary. Analysts are saying, well, we have the data, but we're not seeing anything usable. And the engineers are saying, well, we sent the data over. How is it configured? Right. So there's always a big struggle there in terms of communication to go and get the analysts and the engineering teams and everybody else involved to make sure that it's not just, okay, well, do we have the right scope of the data, right? It's all the data coming in. Is it configured the right way? Are all the fields, like Monty was saying, are all the fields there? Are all the values there that we're expecting? Is the normalization happening at the right point in time, or is there something that we can do post-processing? So there's just a lot of things that kind of come into play where it becomes very difficult, and you need a lot of subject matter experts across the different fields to actually make sure that it comes in and is usable right from the start.
And the one thing I want to add on, right, in terms of, Kevin's point around data structure is not just at the ingest stage, but also at the detection stage, right? Do you have some sort of, framework or structure in place, right? I mean, we see organizations all the time kind of go through these major changes where they're restructuring the way how their data is stored, right? Even with some of the clients that we talk to where, they might have everything in something called like index equals prod, let's say, and then they want to branch it off and kind of segment it to something that's a lot more like domain focused, right? Maybe they want to move stuff over to like index equals web or index equals network and things like that. When you're doing these major overhauls, how much upfront work are you doing on your detections state where it's very easy to do that transition, right? Like, do you now have to go back and edit hundreds and hundreds of rules that had hard-coded index values, or are you using something that's a little bit more structured like macros, right? Where all you have to do is now just go ahead and change one macro, and that affects all the alerts that are kind of using it downstream. So just kind of thinking about strategy, right? Just from the get-go, from both angles, from an engineering point of view and also from like an operational point of view.
Yeah, Roth brings up a good point there. There's several times in my past life where specific feeds are being fed into the SIM in different ways, right? Which means that the structure of that underlying raw data is entirely different, which makes sort of the detection engineer, it makes their work a little bit harder in terms of trying to identify what fields map to what and how do we do that normalization. So it's not necessarily the engineer's fault, but there's different mechanisms for sending data to the SIM, going back to Kevin's point as well. And making sure that that's strategically thought out is definitely crucial.
And what advice or steps would you guys have to get started with that? Like, let's say you just started, maybe you're building a SOC, maybe you joined one, and sometimes the wheels are already off the bus, or you see this as a problem, but you're downstream. So there's not much you can do about it unless you have that conversation with your manager and your manager's on board with this, idea of creating this strategy.
Yeah, I can take that one. So the idea here, right, is to, and it sounds easier said than done, but it's kind of like the same way you would start any security project, right? You have to understand yourself as an organization and where all your data sets lie, where all your resources lie, and everything like that. Understand your critical points of entry and whatnot. Now, if that's all difficult to get, or you don't have that readily available, you can do things in parallel, right? As you're identifying that stuff, you can start just targeting your low-hanging fruit, right? You need your Windows event logs. You need to understand what's happening on your endpoints, on your servers, what critical servers or applications do you actively know about that you can start pulling in these logs. It's sometimes better to just kind of bring in everything and start weeding things out, as opposed to identifying a specific use case and only bringing in a data set for a specific use case as you build those out. And the reason behind this is, let's say 6 months, we know these aren't quick projects, right? If I want to bring in a data set, that's a really long project because of all the teams involved that need to do it. So I'm going to choose one data set to accomplish one specific use case within that 6-month period, right? If you're compromised, you don't have data to search, right? So it's not just about building the detections on top. It's about having all the data there, weeding out the stuff that's not security related, and then building all your detections, but you can still have the ability to at least do triage assessments, post-compromise assessments, right? Do some hunting on that data, because that's where a lot of use cases are built and things like that. So identifying the critical points of data where you actively know there's security relevant detail in there. And if people are not familiar with maybe what, or looking for a starting point, I mean, MITRE has all this published as well as I mean, it's not the greatest in the world, but at least it's a starting point to understand which data sets are required for which kinds of detections. So that way you can start building your foundation from a security operations perspective, right? Everything else is just going to start flowing in, but really understanding where I can get my data and that what's relevant and what's not relevant, and going from there is the right way to go.
I think maybe that's where some of the frustration lies, because, I think we say this a lot and we hear this, and over at least the last 10 years, this has kind of been the general, like, know your critical data. And most people still don't know their critical data. So why is that? And I feel like maybe downstream, that's where this whole concept of just SOC chaos and SOC fatigue comes from. So why is this still a thing? And like, how can we start to combat that and actually move forward from just doing the low-hanging fruit to actually moving forward to the maturity?
So there's two sides to that problem. The first problem is not so easily solved, but it has to do with the way organizations are structured and they're siloed off, right? So normally what happens, right, is that the operations center is tasked with, hey, tell me which data sets we need and which detections you want to build on top of it. The problem is that they don't have the business knowledge or that tribal knowledge of the organization to identify the critical assets and the critical business processes and everything they should be collecting data from. So they start with the low-hanging fruit, like I'm saying, right? The Windows event logs, right? The Linux logs, the audit D, making sure all that stuff is there. And they're going to get these data sets and they're not going to know whether they're properly configured, or maybe they do, right? For example, Windows event logs, maybe they don't have process command line logging, but they think it's as good as it's going to get, right? So part of it is that organizational aspect of they don't know what they don't know, right? And they're being told to make a decision, but realistically, they really shouldn't be making the decisions on that. It should be coming from someone who understands the business in conjunction with them who understand the threat. Now, the other side of it is just understanding what you should actually be trying to detect, right? Now, what happens with, I mean, and every SOC analyst, SOC manager, SOC lead, even every CISO can relate, right? Every time there's a threat that hits some sort of news wire, right, or news platform or something like that, it's, hey, are we affected, right? How does this apply to us? Are we compromised? It's the same like 3 questions every single time. And then everybody scrambles trying to figure out, oh, well, actually, we don't have this vendor, or we have this vendor, but we don't have this version, or whatever it may be. But the reality is that sometimes it's affecting a specific operating system or a platform or something like that, where you can go ahead and easily tell and say, hey, well, maybe this campaign was performed by XYZ threat group, but that threat group only affects these kinds of platforms over these techniques or whatever it may be, right? If I want to relate it to MITRE for an easier understanding. And quickly making that assessment, you can easily tell, well, hey, we're actually not affected by this, or we are affected by this, and we should go and invest more time on developing detections for this kind of stuff that could be affecting our organization today. But narrowing it down to that kind of mentality of saying, well, that's great. There's all these detections. There's a billion TTPs out there that I can try and detect. Understand at least what operating systems I have, or what logs from which operating systems I have, right? Understand the threat groups that are facing our organization, and narrowing it down, okay, well, where they do these tactics and techniques over these platforms, let me try and at least narrow down my scope to this, right? That way, if there's a new threat that happens, you can easily say, well, that kind of falls outside of what we're actively being affected by. Maybe this is more of a low priority thing.
I know all of you have probably gotten that call or question from your higher ups, whether it's the CISO or someone else in the organization. Is there any way that you guys have found to answer that, whether you're saying, okay, it's not really about what, yes, let's answer the question, yes, we're protected, or no, we're figuring it out. But maybe what's a better question that the CISOs or, your managers should be asking about that they can actually help you in the future make sure those operating systems are secure?
Yeah, I don't mind taking that one. So in a previous role, I reported to our CIO/CISO, and I think that was a question I got on the daily basis of, this ransomware, are we affected? Well, first off, you can use your computer, we're not affected, which is probably not the response to give. But a lot of times it came down to saying, well, we're not affected by this, but yes, ransomware is obviously something that's always going to keep us up at night. It's something that's going to continually gain in popularity of being used for malware. But then we would go through the threat models that we had created as far as this is ransomware, this is how it would affect us, this is what we have for protections in place. And it was kind of like a reassuring thing on a weekly basis of like, we have XYZ for visibility, we have these types of detections in place, we have these, this is what our firewall is set up to, this is what our host-based security systems are set up to, and just kind of reiterating what we had for our defense in depth. And that way we can kind of move forward to whatever the next hack was so we could re-answer the question again.
That makes a lot of sense. Rohit, I feel like you have ideas on this.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna say, kind of touching upon what Rebecca was just saying, right, is that every single time this question's asked, you are kind of formatting your answer the same way, right? You're going back to the same like data sets, or there's no proper workflow kind of set up to make answering this question a lot easier, right? It kind of goes back to like that, 24 hours in a day is not enough, right? When you're just spending so much time kind of tackling these same questions, how can we speed up some efficiencies, right? Like how can we almost create a framework for answering, even these type of questions, right? Not just from an operational point of view, but how do I point out and say, okay, yeah, we're talking about the next hot ransomware or the next, APT that's in the news right now. How can I make it a lot easier and even make it so that the CISO or some higher exec can just go straight to where does, how our detection coverage looks like so they can answer the question themselves, right? So bringing that these type of questions just to higher visibility.
Yeah, I always found that it's very time consuming translating the technical details to somebody of that level of a management level because of the translation from technical to business. And Rohit is right in saying that there's no real easy way in order to do it and do the right investigation to understand those detections. But if you build a framework so that it's easily translatable to understand, here are detection gaps, here are where we are strongly covered, here are our priorities from a adversarial perspective, and sort of paint a picture for them that is constantly dynamic and updated. That's an easy way for somebody to save a lot of work and save a lot of time in terms of answering questions that may not be directly impacting your organization, but somebody else within your industry, and sort of keep going in that route.
So I'm in complete agreement, but I think it's a bit bigger than that, right? I think the problem not entirely lies with how do we respond to those kinds of questions. I think the problem normally lies with the question itself, right? And the reason I'm saying that is just because ransomware. I mean, come on. I love that one because it's hey, there's this new ransomware or whatever it may be. But the reality is that you're not trying to detect the ransomware. It's too late at that point, right? What you really should be concerned about is not detecting the ransomware, but the typical patterns of pre and post exploitation and compromise activity that occurs before the ransomware is executed, right? And it's all very typical behavior. The reality is that if an organization, instead of saying, hey, Revel ransomware is out there, are we affected by Revel ransomware, right? The response shouldn't be, well, hey, are we affected by the ransomware itself? Because every organization is affected by the ransomware. That's not the right questions that people should be asking. It should be analyzing the behaviors or the patterns that take place before the ransomware is executed, right? And understanding, hey, are we protected against the behaviors? Are we protected against the initial access that occurred? How does it get into our environment? How does that lateral movement occur before the ransomware is executed? Are we protected against those things, right? Maybe our IPS can protect us against the lateral movement. Maybe we don't have the vulnerability that's typically being used for the initial access, right? Maybe our accounts have 74 factors of authentication, and therefore we're not really that effective between these brute force attempts that are utilized by whatever ransomware campaign is going on. So it's not necessarily, hey, are we affected by this ransomware? That's kind of irrelevant, right? What's really relevant is, are we affected by the normal patterns of how they get into and move laterally within our organization? That's what's important.
So it really sounds like, and I think you guys all touched on it a little bit, but it really comes down to detections. And detections are the preventative measure, but how can we validate and prove the detections are actually working in the system, right? So how can you actually make sure you're being proactive, or how can you start to build your detections and structure your detections in a way that you can move forward?
Yeah, so there's the old methodology of how to do this, and then there's somewhat of a newer methodology in terms of how to do this. The old methodology is really having a red team, which is still part of the new methodology, but having a red team running exploits and looking for IOCs, right? looking for hash values, IP addresses, looking for this kind of stuff within technical articles or doing your own exploits or whatever it may be, right? And then pumping these IOCs into some sort of threat intel or automatic block patterns or whatever it may be, right? But the reality is it's really easy to bypass IOC detection, right? It's not really not that difficult. So instead of running these exploits or these threats and trying to understand what the exploit is communicating to, right? What's more important, not that that's not important, that still has its foundational base of detection, but in today's world, what's more important is understanding not what the threat communicates to entirely or the exploit. It's understanding the logs generated by the systems after the exploit is actually occurs within the organization. Because by understanding the logs generated, right, I can effectively create a detection mechanism for that exploit. If I know that it just exploits the system and does whatever, right, but I'm just looking at IOCs and hashes, that only gets me 40% there because it's really not that difficult to change that, right? But if I understand the logs generated, the behaviors of the operating system, for example, when that exploit occurs, I can actually create a pretty viable detection that I know it doesn't matter if it's been changed and the IOCs are different, if the hash value is different, right? The behavior is going to be the same. And I can make a viable detection based off that.
I can add to that too, in saying that, the concept of purple teaming, I've definitely created my best detections in my career by doing that. And there's a few outcomes that can come from purple teaming. The first being that you actually see it live within your SIM, right? So you see that TTP, you see the understanding raw data in order to build your detection. But secondary to that is you start to understand visibility gaps within your data feeds, right? So if you're not logging specific event codes from a Windows perspective, you may not necessarily know that unless it's tried on your network. So it also brings back some outcomes to how do you improve from a visibility standpoint in order to have the right visibility, in order to build those right detections to cover those tactics or vulnerabilities that are coming out.
And also to add on to that, right, is just kind of validating that these detections that you're building out, maybe on like a annual basis, still make sense, right? Because your environment will change all the time, and maybe the way you had certain feeds logging at one point, isn't the same anymore. At our previous company, we used to do rule validation on like an annual basis, and the number of rules that were broken that needed to be fixed was actually pretty high, right? Which was good in that we realized, okay, this, even though we said we had X amount of rules active, we realized that a good portion of them weren't working. So going back and just ensuring that yes, it's still relevant. Yes, we care about this, or no, we have better detections that we wrote down the road, and we can go ahead and decom it, right? So just continuing that cycle.
Right. Just to actually add on to what Rohit is saying, right? The idea of regressively testing is extremely important in your detections, and obviously the best way to do this is having some sort of script or something that can automatically do this for you. And from my experience, the simplest way to do this is that when you actually either have a live exploit that occurred and you created a detection over it, or you have a red team, blue team exercise that generates the logs necessary, you basically store those logs indefinitely, right? And you try and go and rerun exploits. And the reason for the indefinite is that, yes, the logs may change over time, but when you have a framework in place, right? For example, the macros that were being discussed before that has these code blocks that are built, those code blocks change over time. So you need to test against a live example of when the exploit occurred against we know for a fact that it triggered against this data set. Rerun it against it just while these kind of code blocks are changing over time, because they are. And then the other thing is that if you can repeat the exploit every period of time to generate new logs with whatever logging mechanisms have changed, you need to validate that the detection still works in its entirety, right? I mean, Windows logs change over OS updates and things like that. Maybe it's no longer affected, maybe it is, right? But there's needs to be periodic validations that not only are your detections still relevant, are there any changes happening within the code that your detections run on that could potentially break your ability to effectively respond or be notified?
And Rebecca, I know that you're currently building all of this. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around just how you're approaching this from a detection standpoint and automation and all of that.
Yeah, for sure. So it's really interesting, obviously, coming from prior to my current role, being in an established SOC and leading that, and then building one from scratch. Efficiency ratings in general are critically important. There's no point in having a broken rule. It's just going to lead to more false positives or worse, false negatives. So one of the things we found in my previous SOC and that we're implementing in the current one was, rather than having it set at like an annual period that you review all your rules, is when you have something that's triggered to the level of incident, obviously you do your root cause analysis. And then in general, any big attack that's going on, you want to do somewhat of a root cause analysis. That way you can identify the actual patterns. But then you also talk about the efficiency ratings with that specific alert. Did this find what you wanted to? Didn't it? And then every time we close out an alert that we're looking at, it has an efficiency rating. So it's kind of constantly being updated rather than being a full separate effort. It's just something that just becomes part of the natural triage process.
Yeah, and that makes me feel like, there's kind of this automation aspect to this all. And, it's probably always on everyone's roadmap, but it kind of seems to me that it's towards the end of the cycle when it comes to the response aspect, rather than maybe throughout your entire process that you're setting up. So I don't know if you can talk to how you're kind of strategizing around that. And I know the guys have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, automation, yeah, is literally the first line item on every quarterly roadmap that you're creative, trying to automate some type of processes. I know, Jade, you and I have talked in the past of SOCs are constantly asked to do more with having less resources, having less people, especially in this COVID time period and moving forward. So automation for us is we do our best to kind of get in front of it. So anything where you have just menial tasks of ingesting logs on a regular basis or making slight changes or even implementing firewall blocks, things like that, we do try to automate as much as possible, but we're still, for the most part, reactive with automation of going forward. We're just trying to build some type of process so we can kind of cover our basis right now as we are a growing team. And then when we get more resources of more people onboarding and things like that, then we go back and automate them. But we do still start the current manual processes of which ones we want to automate. That way we can make sure that they get on the appropriate roadmap so they are given the time that they need to switch over.
And I'd love to start a little shameless plug here, a little bit around detection automation and what does that really mean and why is that important and why people should start kind of thinking about throwing in automation from all levels, not just from the end remediation and response side.
Sure, I can go. So I think it's a constant battle between correlation and what a correlation actually means from a detection standpoint, right? So I think that you are looking for a specific tactic and technique, and you kind of understand that we're looking at a specific Windows event, and we're looking at sign-in events for that, right? That can potentially drive noise, right? And then you're continuously trying to tune that rule as a ton of alerts are firing on glass. But being able to correlate those across different tactics and techniques that look from an adversarial perspective, what an adversary might actually be doing is very valuable. And being able to sort of automate that code across the different tactics and techniques to string them together is even more valuable from a time sequence sort of perspective, right? So being able to automate sort of code development of correlation on top of signals is definitely something that is of value and will drive sort of high fidelity, high efficacy rules rather than just looking at a specific signal that is doing some sort of correlation maybe within a stats command, but still driving a lot of noise.
And I can add on to that. So a lot of organizations today are struggling with this aspect, right? They get a lot of individual identifiers that trigger and produce a lot of noise, and it's too much to kind of weed through. Maybe there's malicious activity in there, maybe there isn't, but somebody still has to go through it to identify it, right? So the idea is that there's a lot of identifiers that can be utilized within patterns, within sequences. And the first step that a couple organizations have taken already is that the idea of risk-based alerting, right? Which is basically you need to have a very well thought out risk framework in place that's maintained, and you're working with whichever risk experts in your organizations that define that right, has to be updated, and then from there plugged into your actual detections to make sure that you're producing something viable. The problem is that it still gives you the ability to miss things if not a lot of activity occurs, or potentially risky activity within a period of time, because these things are noisy. It's going to still generate stuff. It's still going to generate noise. So overlaying patterns and sequences based off tactics and techniques, like Monty had mentioned, right, is really going to get you the rest of the way there, right? Yes, risk is important, but understanding what's possible from a pattern and sequencing perspective is arguably more important, right? If I know certain campaigns use these kinds of patterns, whether it be initial access followed by execution followed by persistence, right? And then maybe a 42-hour delay for lateral movement or a C2 channel to be established, well, then that's a pattern, right? And that's a very high level basic pattern, but I can utilize my noisy identifiers in a sequence to go and say, when this pattern occurs, let me know. I don't care when all the identifiers underneath trigger individually in whatever order, but if this pattern occurs, I need to know about it, right? And that's really going to help analysts go and reduce their noise, reduce their efforts from just focusing on the stuff that's important in their environment.
Just to add on to that, right? I think, in my previous role, that was something that we struggled with is, when you're trying to come up with net new content, right? So these net new identifiers or signals, what have you, we didn't want to introduce something into production that was super noisy, right? We don't want to overwhelm the SOC analysts as they were, right? They have here's the number of average alerts we face per day. What we don't want to do is increase it, 10%, 15%, things like that. So when we're building out new content, we're automatically, putting in, allow lists. We're trying to reduce the noise as much as we can. And sometimes what happens is you overtune the rule, right? And sometimes when you have incidents, you're going back and you're doing root cause analysis, you realize, oh, wait, we actually ended up missing this, right? So this whole concept of it's okay to have noisy, signals. Let's just go ahead and store them, maybe on like a hunting index or some area where we can just collect this and collect enough signals where we can go ahead and now build correlation on top of these noisy signals, right? Is something that we've operationalized here over at AmloLogic, but I think is a good methodology that a lot of people on this call can start to take back to their SOCs, right? Is you don't have to have every single a net new rule doesn't have to be 100% high efficacy, right? It's not like when a rule fires, this is it. This is like the smoking gun, right? It's okay to have noisy signals here and there, as long as you're correlating it and you're doing this like additional level of like enhancements. You can still capture a lot more than just these like finding the needles in the haystack.
Yeah, you need the framework in place in order to actually do this effectively. It's not just, hey, well, let's just go and deploy something and try and make patterns out of nothing. You need the right framework in place, the right abstraction layer, and the right logic on top of that abstraction layer to actually make these kinds of pattern detections.
Yeah, what I'm kind of hearing is make sure you take out the noise from the rules that just aren't serving you anymore. So at least that's the aside, but then all of the other noise, use it to your advantage. So it's not necessarily noise, actually. It's gonna, by using all of that, that's going to give you the story, that's going to give you the pattern. So don't consider all of these things noise. Consider it as part of the story, as long as you then set up the frameworks.
Right. The perfect example of this, it's actually my favorite example because it's just so simple, is threat actors like to pull down files, they like to modify permissions, and they like to execute them, right? This is common sysadmin activity as well, from a Linux perspective. A file download, very noisy rule. File modified, very noisy rule. File executed, very noisy rule. But if you look for a pattern in that and just sequence the three together within a very short, let's call it a second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds period of time, now you don't have to look at any of the noise from the 3 separate events. You just have to look at when those 3 events trigger within a small time window, right, back to back in that specific order. And that's going to give you a lot of efficacy within your detections, and it's going to save a lot of time.
And from a hunting perspective, everyone's out there, you know, I think a lot of people maybe don't know where to start necessarily sometimes, but I know we had this concept of participation awards. I think as a whole, we're all sick of them in our normal lives, as well as now in the SOC, where it's a successful hunt if you just go out and do it. But how are you really, like, how can we get rid of those participation awards and really help to identify real gaps to get and real visibility of where you're looking and what you're doing? Rebecca, I know you talked a lot about visibility too and data. And Kevin, we're going to let you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think participation rewards are fun. I mean, I have a bunch of them clearly, but yeah, there's really no point to them. I think the participation at that point is that you're learning. So one of the big things that we do is a lot of with like our tier one people, we've always set up just kind of continuous training and also shadowing. We call it like a mentoring program with some of our tier three analysts, so that they're still getting the participation and getting out there and hunting, even though they might not be doing the most, but they're getting that aspect of it. But kind of how we've moved away from it, if anything, is we've tried to gamify it a little bit of adding in different like point systems. If you're finding stuff that's actionable, we use a system called bonusly points, and then you get some bonusly points that can be used for anything from swag from the company or gift cards, something like that. And we found that like, I mean, it's a classic tech person. You want to make it into a game of, and we found that it's actually more effective than I thought it would be to gamify it. And then if nothing else, it gives you bragging rights over someone else. But it's all moving towards like the final purpose of being able to hunt. Because the more that we can hunt and find actionable like items out in the wild, the better our overall SOC is going to be.
I think that's actually a really good way to do it, honestly. I think, and given the circumstances, right? Because the whole reason why the way hunting is done against raw data sets is just because, well, it's hard to get the detections in place, right? But I mean, if you have the ability to get the detections in place and at least get your basis in terms of behavioral detections, get them all ironed out, a successful hunting exercise should be producing a new viable detection. And a lot of the times it's just very minor things and it's applauded for and whatnot. And it's kind of like this the whole idea of participation, right? Hey, you hunted and something happened out of that, right? Where you wasted 4 hours of your day and got maybe like a small tuning opportunity to remove 10 events per day or something like that. I do like Rebecca's methodology, though. I think it does gamify it. It does allow analysts to do it. But assuming you did have the detections in place, so you had somewhere where you can get these production-ready detections, right? Analogic, for example. And we have that abstraction layer, right, that Rohit was talking about earlier. True hunting should really occur against that abstraction layer because you're no longer concerned about producing detections. You're no longer concerned about hunting your data to see if you can produce a new detection against whatever TTP, right? The idea here is to go and hunt against your detections or the outputs of your detections to either reduce additional noise. For example, you could have noticed a file download, modified, executed, that I was saying earlier, and notice that, yes, those three in order, that is a viable detection. So I could reduce my alert volume by just putting those as background signals and producing one detection on top of that that goes and produces a single alert when that pattern triggers. So detecting and hunting for patterns and sequences on top of your detection outputs is more viable and it gives you a higher rate of efficacy than just always searching against raw data. The reality is that raw data, what you're searching against billions of logs, trying to identify a pattern within those within those logs, it's absurdly difficult, right? We're put up against the odds to try and do that, right? So without having an effective red team and blue team deployed within an organization, whether the red team's external or not, and kind of isolating your detection engineering to those things, hunting against these vast volumes of raw data is almost pointless, right? Because the value that you get from it is extremely minimal. Obviously, there's things that you can do to go and make it more pleasing to do, right? Like the game. But the reality is that the why you have to do those things is because it's fatiguing against the analyst, right? Always searching against this vast volume of data, trying to identify something. You're always against the odds, always.
Yeah, and there's a couple points right there, right, that Kevin touched upon is, when it comes to hunting, one of the biggest questions I always ask is, how do I start, right? Where do I hunt, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why, the MITRE framework really blew up, right, in popularity, is because it now gives you some sort of framework. It gives you an area on where you can focus. Right now, all of a sudden, organizations are utilizing it and saying, okay, these are our priorities. Let's go ahead and focus on these techniques, these tactics, right? And it makes it a little bit easier for analysts to focus on, right? But at the end of the day, unless you're actually utilizing your raw data and enriching it with some of this information, it's still going to be hard for analysts to find, these type of to be effective in the hunts, right? And the reason why, purple teaming, red teaming, the reason why we're stressing on it, during this call is because, it is like throwing the analyst a bone, right? It's like saying, hey, here's a perfectly valid use case. You had, some some red team performing this activity. Now go ahead and see what type of logs they produce, string together a detection, but now you have a very specific detection for that, use case or incident. Try to gather more like high level like details around that activity, right? Don't necessarily just write one or two alerts for that exact use case that the red team detected on, but try to log some of these different activities that the red team did in a different index, in like this hunting index. And now that you're gathering these valuable log sets, right, that's not only just looking at that one host machine or coming from that one IP address, you're kind of looking at it generically. Well, now you can start hunting just overall within your environment and try to pair these correlated events together.
Yeah, and even add that to that, I can't recall how many hunt queries that I've created alerts that sent to my email, and I never stored them within information. So after the hunt is over, I'm still looking for valuable information. That's not necessarily being stored there anywhere, right? So if you store that stuff within something like a summary index, it's not only shareable across everybody else that's contributing to a hunt or part of the security operations center. It's now something that's stored, and it's an entity of interest that can be correlated based upon a user or a host or any other field associated to that specific hunt, right? So the concept of sharing that information, the value of that query, and then storing it somewhere that's shareable across everybody else within the ops sort of organization is valuable as well.
And with about 10 minutes left, sorry, Rohit, I'll let you hold your thought. We do have a few questions coming in. So if you guys do have questions, please put them in the Q&A or feel free to do it directly in the chat. We'll let Rohit finish his thought. And I want to get to a few things around cloud. We'll probably be having a follow-up webinar specifically around cloud and containers and being proactive versus reactive and all of that, but we'll touch on it a little bit. Rohit, finish your thought, and then I'll jump into some Q&A that we've gotten already.
Sure. I mean, it was just going to be a one-liner, kind of tying it all back to your original question, right, Jade, around detection engineering. Why are we trying to do this? It's really just to give analysts back their time so they can do something more proactive, right, like these hunts. Because when we were running around just chasing fires, and even at my old SOC, we were always one incident away from setting our deliverables back by like a week or something, right? And when you're working in the SOC, you never know what day is going to be, okay, I have time to do work, or what day is going to be, okay, now I'm putting out like 3 fires, right? We always joked, it's always like, welcome to the Thunderdome. That's what it was. You never know what you were in for.
When do you say yes to a webinar when you might have other things that pop up?
Yeah.
So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for listening as well. I know there's a lot going on, but this is super impactful, I think, information and a great discussion. We have one question talking about asking, how can we validate our behavior-based detection system?
So we kind of went over that a little bit before, right? The idea of regressively testing and automating that as much as possible definitely makes your life easier. But I mean, if you're going to if you're going to go and validate a behavior detection system, you would have to go and emulate the behaviors of what you're trying to detect. So if you're trying to go and determine a particular adversary, I would go and do my research against the different typical campaign patterns of that adversary, right? And have a red team simulation come in and emulate those patterns, right? If it's insider threat, you could probably emulate that yourself within your network and see if you could get away with it, right? If your SOC detects you, well, then there's your your test bed, right? I think that's the best way to do it. It's just having somebody come in or even doing it yourself, depending on what behavior you're trying to detect and go through that.
Yeah, just to add on that really quickly, I think that also just goes back to like the importance of purple teaming, because those are perfect examples to test out those systems, because you know exactly what's happening, you know what you can see and what it's finding.
And the concept of purple teaming too, I mean, do you think that, Rebecca, you're in a pretty small, you're growing. I feel like sometimes I hear, oh, well, we're too small for a purple team, or we don't have time for a purple team. What would you say to those people saying that?
I guess that they're liars. I mean,
Yeah.
the reality is like purple teaming could be anything from a large scale, something that you do on a quarterly basis with a full set of outlined rules. But at the same time, it could be somebody who's either at your company or you running tools that you know will cause red team activity for you to test on a very basic level. I mean, I've run purple team exercises where I was one of 2 analysts and one where I had a SOC of 20 people. It's just really, purple teaming can kind of scale up with however mature your SOC is. And the reality is a level, I guess, if you're determining if a SOC is even mature to begin with and they don't mention purple teaming, it's a pretty good guess that they're not mature at all.
There's probably a lot of work to do there.
One last point on the behavior, on validating behavior. Once you run through that exercise, a lot of organizations fail to go back and kind of do the atomic testing for the stuff they missed, right? And what I mean by that is that running a full simulation, right, is great. You're going to go and see where you stopped what, right? But you have to understand the specific things that were executed in what order at which specific times and validate each micro component of that exploit, of whatever happened, right? Each portion of the detection is important, not just, hey, I stopped it at this level, or hey, yeah, we're good to go against this emulation campaign, right? You need to know this specific exploit occurred at this time. Let me narrow my search to that time. Let me make sure that whatever logs were generated or whatnot, that's my detection. Make sure I have that built into my plan.
Makes sense. We have 2 more questions here. Are there any specific metrics that you track for monitoring improvement in your SOC operations as you put new technologies or tools in place?
I don't mind taking a first stab at this one. It's something that, especially building out a SOC, it's really important that you get some form of metrics. So the big 3 ones that we capture just in general are always time to detection, time to triage, and time to mitigation. And that gives you at least your very basic, your baseline of what you're looking for. And then from there, we take in all of the metrics off of our efficiency testing of the different alerts and detections that we do have created. And then we'll even take a look at kind of the subset of what data that we're actually looking at. And that, again, kind of goes back to not only your gap analysis of what data you have, but making sure that you have actual usable data.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. So that's that is the foundation of SOC metrics, right? But beyond that, more from a strategic point of view, right? You have to understand, going back to what I was saying earlier, understand your organizations, the threats that affect your organizations and whatnot. And by detailing that out, you can effectively map that into some sort of kill chain, such as MITRE, right? And identify your gaps and how well you're covered within particular detection spaces, right? Once you understand that, then you can start producing metrics and gauge an almost maturity score, right? Saying, hey, I have these data feeds or I'm lacking these data feeds, and I have these detections or I'm lacking these detections, right? And you can actually build a plan to move forward and show your KPIs as you actually progress from a maturity level, as you build out new detections, as you bring in data feeds. But it kind of gives you that strategic view and roadmap in terms of what you're doing, what you should be doing, and how do you get better, right, to actually detect and prevent threats within your organization.
So we have time for one more question. Before we get to that question, I just want to give everyone a little shout out, say thank you. Also, everything that we've talked about here today, especially, what Kevin just was mentioning on prioritizing and understanding and mapping your detections and mapping your rules so you can identify those gaps and understand what data you do have. This is all things that AnvoLogic can do and does do that we not only these guys, but a whole other team behind it that have worked in the SOC and that know these problems. And so instead of having to do it manual or go build it yourself, this is what AnvoLogic has built. So please check out anvologic.com. We have a click-through product tour on your own, or feel free to ask for a demo. You might see one of these beautiful faces on that demo and get to ask them other questions, but definitely go check that out. We have other information on the website. And we're not getting time to talk about the cloud, so we will definitely do another webinar, specifically probably a panel style like this again, all about the cloud and detections around cloud specifically. But I'm going to ask this one question and then give it back to you, the panelists, for just final thoughts, and then we will say thank you and goodbye. So the last question we got in here, and we did cover some of this, but I think maybe just getting a specific answer, is when we talk about automation in the SOC, we're working on creating more use cases or correlation rules, but still there are so many logs which require SOC L1 analysts. How can we make sure that monitoring is minimum for the analyst? Any suggestions?
Sure. So this goes back to the idea of pattern and sequence analysis, right? You're going to have your detections that produce a lot of noise. The idea is just to put them in a format, right, that they're not actively alerting your tier 1 analysts, right? But there's secondary logic on top of that that's kind of correlating the outputs of all your detections and looking for sequences and patterns. That way, when analysts receive alerts, right, it's already done the majority of the work for them. It's already correlated a sequence of detections or patterns that may be malicious within your organization, right? Whether it be based off specific TTPs being sequenced or specific general categories like tactics and techniques or whatever it may be, or even cyber kill chain phases for that matter, right? So I think that would be the best way to handle correlation and reduce noise. And mind you, right, a lot of organizations think correlation is, well, look at all my data sets and produce one detection. That's not correlation. Correlation is, you can be looking at the same data set, but it's multiple detections and correlating together, right? That's where the value is.
Great. Well, final thoughts from everyone. If there's one thing you can leave everyone with of what they should go back right now and go do, whether it's if they're a manager, if they're a CISO, if they're an analyst, maybe you can tackle one of those areas on just a best practices, or like a make sure you go do this right now.
Yep, so I can start with this one. And really the 3 key takeaways from my end, and we kind of touched upon this during the session, right, is one, if you're not doing purple teaming, try to prioritize that within your environment, right? So that's really key. 2, as hard as it is, try not to overtune all your alerts, right? If you're having an issue with all the alerts that you're collecting or signals that you're collecting, store them elsewhere, and try to find a better way to correlate. And then, 3 is just, and it kind of goes back to the whole detection automation, right? Is, find areas where, your analysts are seeing the most pain points. Even if it's just, 1%, improvement, each day, right? That 1% over a span of a year, adds up to a huge number, right? So just little improvements here and there, does make a big difference over the long run.
Rebecca?
I think the more of just kind of playing off of that is just always look at evolving your SOC, whether it's evolving the technology that it's using, evolving the detections specifically that they're writing. Just always look at advancing and finding new and kind of interesting ways to kind of expand their reach.
Mike?
Yeah, build ways to be able to translate, technical details and answer those difficult questions in a more dynamic and automated way, so that you're not spending so much time trying to answer questions of impacts of other organizations, and you can sort of continue to, build upon detections and be more proactive in the space by saving yourself time in that area. And then the second piece is sort of think outside the box when it comes to a detection standpoint. Don't try and overtune to rules. Try to build some correlation between them, and sort of store that information in a summary index or some sort of data lake where you guys can go back and use this as a starting point for hunting exercises.
Kevin?
Yep. So I agree with what everybody said, but I guess to add on to more of a strategic point is get a better understanding of your organization and the threats affecting it. Right, understand where your weak points are, how people can get in, how people can move laterally and whether they can't, and focus your efforts there, right? Perform whatever atomic testing is required to actually produce the right detections, and then work on building a framework to sequence those detections to actually better protect yourselves.
And mine's going to be check out Anvologic to see how Anvologic can help you do these things. Just kidding, kind of. So I want to thank you all, and we'll see you next time.